because the problem of how to define common international purposes for a modern world is not new. In fact, I think the most productive intellectual ferment about these issues probably occurred between 1890 and 1950. During the late 19th century, there were swirling, fundamental debates about nationalism, imperialism, capitalism, socialism, anarchism, populism, progressivism, pacifism, and more. Industries, technologies, breakthroughs in chemistry, transportation, communications, new forms of commerce were rapidly transforming the shape of the world. Global empires extending their reach with astonishing ease, huge movements of populations. Everywhere, traditional beliefs and ways of life were battered and eroding. I was very struck in reflecting on this period and the ideas people came up with back then, around the turn of the century, with the observations of one of the most thoughtful and literate men of that age, Henry Adams. Henry Adams, a renowned man of letters. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all lived at the pinnacle of American politics. His great-grandfather is now the subject of an HBO miniseries. Adams himself had become a somewhat dyspeptic intellectual by the year 1900 when he visited the Paris Exposition of that year, the Paris Exposition of 1900, which was a proud exhibit of all the wonders of the new modern age. One of those wonders, which was rapidly coming into use during the 1890s, was electricity. So Adams had this experience in which he walked up to one of these new electrical dynamos, 40 feet high. I want you to imagine the picture. This balding, bearded man in his dapper suit, standing silently, gazing upward, inches away from this 40-foot machine, whirring silently and generating vast power. In its way, Adams thought, the dynamo was a perfect symbol for the impersonal forces animating his age. In his imagination, he contrasted the dynamo with the greatest expressions of human force in more traditional ages of man. In his imagination, he thought, what would have been the equivalent of the dynamo as an expression of human force in traditional life? And the great metaphorical example he came up with was the magnificent medieval cathedral of Chartres. That cathedral represented the finest achievement of traditional life, in that case 13th century life. Adams actually wrote about the fantastic variety and detail of statuary, the extraordinary artistry of its glass, the sheer scale of the thing, which in the 13th century fantastically dwarfed anything within hundreds of miles in any direction. The dynamo, of course, reflects one kind of power. The cathedral, too, is an expression of vast forces that had to come together in that age to create it. The forces that produced that vast work, the forces it expressed, were those of faith. In that case, faith above all in the Virgin. Adams then wrote about the metaphorical contrast of, quote, the dynamo and the Virgin in a pair of books, one Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres, and its sequel, The Education of Henry Adams. In those books, he introduced two fundamental themes. One is the struggle for a unity of belief. You see, the magnificence of Chartres was a monument of hope, hope for a civitas Dei, a community of God, a hope that had reached a kind of peak in the 13th century. The hope for a spiritual unity of people, in this case the unity of Christendom, that would strive with a common faith to realize common ideals. And Adams then contrasted that with the dynamo, its impersonal, inhuman power, which he thought was a monument to the chaos and multiplicity that modernity had unleashed. So writing about this contrast beneath his usual veneer of sardonic world weariness that he always affected, Adams was plainly hoping that he could somehow reverse a process in which any traditional notion of common ideals seemed to be decaying, dying from a kind of entropy of belief. When friends would ask him about his politics, he would puckishly call himself a conservative Christian anarchist. To him, it was a private joke, because what he was saying, and which his correspondents understood, is he wanted to tear down the establishment to restore ideals that no longer seem to exist. There is a second fundamental theme in Adams's work. It is his wonderment at the sheer scale of the new forces he sees coming into play. He actually played in various parlor games of calculating the vast exponential rate of increase in the physical energy, the commerce, the industry, just in his lifetime since the 1830s. Then he would observe wittily the follies of essential incomprehension of the human beings who, while they thought they were riding those forces, were really more their creatures than their masters. Adams would have agreed completely with the later bitter comment of the French premier Georges Clemenceau, who commented that human beings are like apes who have stolen Jupiter's thunder. Adams tried to summarize some of these themes, the entropy of values, the match of human society against modern forces, in a letter he wrote to a scientist friend of his in 1905. He wrote to his friend that he didn't think it would need another century or half century to tip thought upside down. Law, in that case, would disappear as theory or a priori principle and give place to force. Morality would become police. Explosives would reach cosmic violence. Disintegration would overcome integration. 1905. Adams was, of course, all too prescient. He died as one world war came to a close that had inspired many to sense, as Albert Schweitzer did, that the suicide of civilization is in progress, and the next landslide will very likely carry it away. And the next landslide almost did. Adams was really asking two essential questions. First, can the nations define and sustain a civilized world in this modern globalized era in some common way? And second, can human beings constructively master the unnatural and unprecedented forces they have put in motion? So when we think about the ideals to address these fundamental questions, we're really debating the goals of some kind of global civilization, or if you prefer, some kind of law-abiding world. Now, if you think then back to the question of how would an American government try to capture this in some sort of policy concept it could use to lead the world, let's reflect briefly on other big P policy concepts that the American government has used effectively and durably at other times in our history. The list is short but memorable. No entangling alliances. The heritage of George Washington's political testament to Americans. Or the Monroe Doctrine. Or the open door, which was devised in order to stop the carve-up of China in 1900 and keep the world open, just as it hoped to keep a door open, in that case to China. But the concept, of course, grew to have much larger meanings. Or in more recent times, a term like containment or deterrence. Notice about these terms, like containment or deterrence. These terms are not, neither Democrats nor Republicans can claim ownership exclusively of these terms. Both Democrats and Republicans supported these general directions, and then they argued heatedly about what they meant and about how to apply them. In other words, they shared a sense of common purpose within broad parameters, and then argued about what that would mean in practice.